Hi guys, many students have requested much about a particular topic known as transport of CO2. So just the way I teach, I will say that before entering into the transport of CO2, we will first see a basic knowledge about what is the breathing and exchange of gases all about. है ना? So before entering into the transport of CO2 part, we will see a basic look where we can understand what is the difference between all the parts where the respiration and breathing takes place. Nice? Okay. So first we see that from the atmosphere, from the atmosphere, we inhale as well as exhale the gases. In common layman language, if we say, we inhale the oxygen and we exhale the CO2. So this point in this chapter is known as the breathing, which involve what? Inhalation as well as the exhalation. Then the inhaled gases is then transported to the next part, that is the part of alveoli, where the alveoli receives the O2 from the atmosphere and CO2 from the internal part of the body. In this part, the exchange of gases again take place. The O2 is given to the capillaries of blood and the CO2 is received by the alveoli. So this is the second process of breathing and exchange, and it is the site of alveoli, whereas the respiration is a kind of external respiration. Then what happens next? This gases which have been transferred is now transported for the last reaction or for the last process. This is the third process known as the transportation, and the transported part is now received by the tissues which is actually in the need of the oxygen. So with the help of the oxygen acquired by the atmosphere, this tissue goes under respiration to release energy and we get CO2 up here. At the site of tissue level, we call it an internal respiration. We call it a internal respiration. Nice. So when the oxygen was transported to the tissue part, the CO2 formed here will have a more partial pressure of carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide partial pressure will be received by the purified or the aerated blood and then will again go to the level of will again go to the level of what? Will again go to the level of external respiration. Will again go to the level of external respiration. So actually these are the four steps where our breathing and exchange of gases gets operated. First is the breathing requires inhalation as well as the exhalation. Second is at the site of alveoli, which is what? The second process, also known as the external respiration. The externally respired gases will be transported to the actual needy part, that is the tissue, and this step is known as the internal respiration. When you will visualize all this process, you just have to think one thing, that basically two gases have been transported and exchanged. One is O2 and one is CO2. The nature plays such a beautiful role in that they create an autonomous behavior where due to the increase in oxygen, CO2 gets debinded, and due to the pressure of CO2, oxygen get debinded. This occurs between the external respiration as well as the internal respiration. I hope this part makes you clear with the basics. Then we will start with the actual transport of gases. Again, now we will learn about the transport of gases. Just again, the same thing I will say. Just try to understand the topic. Memorization is very hard to do. So just try to understand the transport of gases. What is the necessity behind the transport? Why is it really needed for the gases to be transported? If you try to understand the biology, it becomes very easy. But when you try to memorize all the topics, it becomes very hard. So why not to understand the topic? Now let's see. I will talk about the transport of gases as a whole, both O2 and CO2 in the same topic. I will try it. So what happen is, we know there is a site of external respiration, means, sorry, internal respiration means at the site of tissue, and we need to transport the gases to the alveoli and from the alveoli as well, from where it will be breathed out by our nostrils in and out. So let's see what happens. I have told you there is basically four steps in the breathing. One is the breathing is as a whole, where we do the inhalation and exhalation, which is just a physical process. Second is at the site of alveoli, that is the external respiration, and third is the site of tissue, which is the internal respiration. And between this, the gases is transported with the help of the blood. Now, what happens? Let's see. When the oxygen is received by the tissue, we will start from here. The glucose, with the presence of oxygen, is broken down into energy, plus it will release CO2. Let's see what happens. When we talk about the transportation of CO2, the CO2 is transported into the three forms. Mark my word, I'm saying three forms. First, which is directly in the form of carbaminohemoglobin. We will write it like this. What is the percentage? It is about 23 to 25. I will go with the 23 percentage. Now, again, the other form that the CO2 take place before getting transported is the bicarbonate form. By bicarbonate form. And it will be better to write not by bicarbonate, in bicarbonate form. And other directly dissolved in plasma. Maximum transportation is in the bicarbonate form, minimum is in the case of dissolved form, that is 7%. So what happens is, we see now what happens when the when we talk about this medium, this whole blank, what I will consider it as a blood. We know generally the blood consists of plasma and the formed elements, and we will be talking about RBC. As you know, transportation of gases is done by the RBC only. So what happens is, I am creating a basic RBC structure here. I'm just creating a RBC structure here, just to make you memorize what happens during the transportation. I have said one RBC consists of about 250 to 280 million molecules of hemoglobin. And now, which is the pigment? Heme is the iron part where the oxygen is joined, and globin is the protein part where the CO2 is joined. Now, what happened is, the hemoglobin initially was having O2, which was received by the alveoli itself. Now, since the CO2 will enter into this part, it will make a cleavage in the bond of oxyhemoglobin, and it will now create HbCO2 plus O2. What did CO2 did? CO2 broke the bond between the hemoglobin and oxygen, that is the oxyhemoglobin, and in the place of oxygen, it created the bond with the hemoglobin. This is known as the carbaminohemoglobin. Why is it so, sir? Why this happens? Why the CO2 is capable of creating a breaking the bond between the HbO2? NCERT writes that hemoglobin is having 20 to 25 times more affinity with CO2 than O2. So since the CO2 at the internal uh, respiration part is having a higher partial pressure, it will obviously create, since hemoglobin is itself having more affinity with the CO2, and also the CO2 at this is partial pressure of CO2 in this form is about 45 mmHg, and at the oxygen it is 40 mmHg. So CO2 is having more partial pressure, and also the hemoglobin is having more affinity. So it creates a scenario where the CO2 is more favorable with the formation of bond with the hemoglobin. Now what happens? This is one case where the oxygen is now released, and this oxygen is taken by the tissue for the further respiration. Other is the bicarbonate form. Again, the CO2 is received by the RBC. What happened here? The CO2 received by the RBC get reacted with the water. In the present, we all know what is the enzyme required for the formation of CO2 and H2O bond. Carbonic anhydrase, biomolecule chapter also is written. Now it will form a bicarbonate ion. This bicarbonate ion again gets broken into different part, that is H plus and HCO3 minus. Now let's see one thing. The membrane of the RBC is permeable to this bicarbonate ion, and it will climb into the plasma part. The HCO3 will be released into the plasma. But if a single negative charge, or if a negative charge leaves a particular membrane, there will be a difference in the neutrality of the RBC as a whole. So the nature have to do something, and a negative charge value should be maintained, for which the chloride ion at the tissue level is pushed back into the RBC. This phenomenon to maintain the neutrality of the RBC is known as the chloride shift. Also, it is also known as Hamburger's phenomenon. Nice. So now what? This HCO3 now get attached with Na plus and forms NaHCO3. Now this NaHCO3 is transported to the alveoli with the help of plasma only. So again the question, there are three forms which CO2 takes place in order to get transported, but there are two mediums by which the CO2 get transported. One directly by the RBC in the form of carbaminohemoglobin, and two in the medium of plasma, bicarbonate and by directly dissolved form. Got it? So these two are transported with the plasma. The plasma transportation is having about 77%. Now let's see another part. What happened here? So I have said you earlier that nature creates a very beautiful situation where the problem of one mechanism becomes the beneficiary part of the other mechanism. What happened here? See, we have maintained the negative charge by pushing inward the chloride ion, but the positive charge of H plus decreases the pH, that is increases the acidity, and since we know the blood will not handle the high acidity medium, so what is that, what happens, is that the RBC is getting high H plus, means low pH, means high acidity. There will be a chance of rupture of RBC itself. So what happens now? The hemoglobin. I have already said there are many hemoglobin. Everyone is having HbO2 right now because it has came from the alveoli part. The HbO2 now, in order to protect the RBC, will receive this hydrogen and release the O2 just to protect the changing medium of RBC. What does that means? That means the HbO2 is playing a role of buffer, where it is not allowing the hydrogen ion to create acidic medium into the RBC. That's okay. Oxygen is again released. The problem of one is creating a beneficiary situation for other. Now this oxygen will be again received by this. So what happens now? We have HbCO2 in the RBC. We have NaHCO3 in the plasma. We have direct CO2 in the plasma itself. Plasma RBC. Now we have loaded the CO2 into the blood. Now what transportation is what? Transportation is just loading of a substance, transporting to the required place and unloading it again. We have loaded, we will transport to the two medium RBC and plasma, and now we will unload it at the site of alveoli. If you want to note it, you can note it. I will move on.